Harlem, New York. 10:23 p.m. Friday, September 16, 1955. The autumn air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of tension that made smart men check their exits twice. Inside the Red Rooster on Lenox Avenue, the jazz quartet played something low and dangerous, the trumpet bleeding notes that seemed to warn everyone present that tonight carried weight. The club was packed with the usual mix, numbers runners counting quiet money, working women nursing gin, and the occasional downtown tourist who thought Harlem was a safari they could buy their way through. Mame Johnson sat at the corner table, positioned with a clear view of both the bar and the front entrance. She wore a midnight blue dress that cost more than most men in that room earned in 3 months. But she wore it like armor, not decoration. At 43, she had learned that being Ellsworth Johnson's wife meant being a target wrapped in silk. And targets didn't get careless in public spaces. The man who approached her table carried himself like money, old money, the kind that came with bloodlines and the unshakable belief that the world existed for his entertainment. His name was Harrison Whitmore III, textile fortune, Connecticut estate. The sort of man who collected experiences the way other people collected stamps, and tonight, he had decided to collect something that didn't belong to him. He placed an expensive crystal glass on her table without asking permission. Champagne, Whitmore announced, his words carrying the slight slur of a man 3 drinks past careful. Dom Prignon. Nothing but the finest for a woman of your caliber. Mame didn't touch the glass. She didn't look up from her cigarette. I didn't order anything.
Baby, this empty room.
Consider it a gift. He slid into the booth across from her, uninvited, his movements loose with alcohol and arrogance.
I'm only going to say this once.
A beautiful woman shouldn't sit alone in a place like this.
Stay out of my territory.
I'm not alone. I'm married. Whitmore laughed,
I told the copper,
a sound that carried across 4 nearby tables and made conversations pause. Married to what? Some street thug who thinks he runs this neighborhood? He leaned closer, close enough that his gin-soaked breath became its own insult.
Get the manager now.
Sweetheart, I've got more money in my wallet than your husband sees in a year. 1 drink. What's the harm? Mamie met his eyes then. Direct, unflinching. My husband is Bumpy Johnson. You need to leave this table. Now. The name should have been a warning. In any legitimate establishment in Harlem, that name was a full stop. An immediate retreat, an apology followed by swift departure. But Harrison Whitmore III had never learned to recognize warnings that didn't come printed on stock certificates. The gangster? He actually smiled. Honey, I've got judges on my Christmas card list and senators who owe me favors. I'm not afraid of some. He used a word that made the air itself seem to contract, a word designed to remind her of her place in his world, a word that carried 400 years of systematic humiliation wrapped in 2 syllables. The room went silent. Not quiet, silent. The trumpet player's note cracked and died. Card games froze mid-deal. Even the bartender stopped wiping glasses, his cloth suspended in midair like time itself had paused to witness what came next. Because at 10:27 p.m., the front door opened. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped into the Red Rooster like shadow made flesh. He didn't scan the room. He didn't need to. His eyes went directly to the corner table, took in the scene with surgical precision, his wife's rigid posture, the uninvited guest, the crystal glass sitting between them like evidence of disrespect. Bumpy adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness. He straightened his tie. He walked across that silent room with the measured pace of a man who had never hurried toward violence, because violence always waited for him. He stopped 3 feet from the table. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at Harrison Whitmore III with the flat, calculating stare of a judge measuring a sentence. "You got 30 seconds, Bumpy said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Stand up. Walk to that door. Keep walking until you're back where you belong. Pretend this never happened." Whitmore snorted, emboldened by gin and a lifetime of immunity purchased with family money. "You don't give me orders, boy. I go where my money takes me." At 10:29 p.m., Harrison Whitmore III made the last mistake of his privileged life.
Stop right there.
He reached
Whatever
across
you
the
think you
table
know, you're
and put his
wrong.
hand on Maymay's wrist.
You have to listen to me. It's not
68 hours
safe.
later, Whitmore would wake up in Harlem Hospital with a jaw wired shut, 3 broken ribs, and a shattered left hand that would never properly hold a pen again. The police report would list it as a mugging. The hospital staff would whisper about the note they found pinned inside his ruined suit jacket. She said no. Remember that. But the physical beating would be just the opening movement of Harrison Whitmore's destruction. Within 2 weeks, his textile contracts would evaporate. His bank accounts would freeze under mysterious federal investigations. His wife would receive photographs not of violence, but of other women, other hotel rooms, other lies that money had kept hidden. The systematic dismantling of his empire would be so
stay out of
precise,
my territory,
so thorough,
or you won't
that
live
even
to see
he wouldn't
tomorrow.
understand who orchestrated it until his family name meant nothing, and his fortune had dissolved into legal fees and settlement payments. The story of how Harrison
We knew
Whitmore
this wouldn't be
III lost
simple.
everything
We just need
is
a
a
moment to
warning
think.
that history has
Getting
tried
too
to
hot in
hide.
here. We have to move fast.
If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to September 16th, 1955, and understand exactly why you never disrespect Bumpy Johnson's wife. Harlem in 1955 operated on 2 distinct economies that never appeared in any financial journal or government report. The first was visible, measured in dollars and cents, where downtown money could purchase entry into jazz clubs and underground card games. The second economy was
Listen very
invisible but
carefully.
absolute,
This is the
measured in
only warning
respect
you will receive.
and enforced through
Do exactly
consequences
as
that
I
no
say.
amount of wealth could mitigate. These parallel systems created boundaries
Certainly,
that
sir.
existed
Would you like the
nowhere
dressing
on
on the
city
side?
maps, but everywhere
And for your
in
wine
reality.
selection tonight.
White men with thick wallets could buy temporary access to the neighborhood's nightlife, but they could never purchase immunity from its justice system. The rules were unwritten but universally understood by anyone who belonged there. Money bought you a seat at the table, but it didn't buy you the right to overturn that table without facing the consequences. Harrison Whitmore III had been insulated from consequences his entire life by 3 generations of textile fortune and political connections. His grandfather had built the Whitmore Empire during the industrial boom, exploiting immigrant labor and purchasing judges to establish a dynasty that survived the
believe you
Depression
just
while
said
working
that.
families
I
starved.
know, but look at your
His father
face.
had refined the operation, modernizing factories while maintaining the family tradition of treating employees as disposable components in a profit machine. Harrison himself had inherited not just wealth, but the bone-deep certainty that the world existed for his entertainment. At 37, he had developed a particular appetite for humiliation as sport. Black chauffeurs, hotel porters, household staff, he treated them as props in his private theater, making inappropriate comments, touching without invitation, demanding forced smiles after deliberate insults. The complaints never went anywhere because the Whitmore family maintained senators and judges on retainer, men who understood that protecting the social order meant protecting men like Harrison from accountability. That Friday night in September, Whitmore had followed rumors of a high-stakes poker game operating near Lenox Avenue, accompanied by 3 business associates who shared his taste for slumming in black neighborhoods while maintaining their racist superiority complex. The poker game proved too controlled and professional for men seeking the chaos they imagined defined Harlem nightlife. By 10 o'clock, his associates had abandoned him, citing early meetings and family obligations, but really fleeing the liability he represented when alcohol dissolved what little judgment he possessed. They left him alone with his money, his entitlement, and
The
no
shipment
one to
needs to
monitor
move
his
tonight,
increasingly
or else the
dangerous
deal is
behavior.
off.
The
Make
Red
sure the
Rooster
coast is
existed in
clear.
permanent duality that men like Whitmore never grasped. On the surface, it was an upscale entertainment venue with exceptional music and electric atmosphere that welcomed anyone who could afford the cover charge. Beneath that surface operated a deeper reality that every local understood instinctively. This was Bumpy Johnson's territory. The club owner paid tribute. The bartenders reported problems. The security staff took orders from men who never appeared on any payroll. When disputes
Listen to me
arose,
closely.
they were settled
I don't
not by
care what
police or
happened,
courts,
you need to
but by
deliver
the
the
man who
merchandise tonight,
considered this
or
place
else.
an extension of his living room. Mame Johnson understood power in ways that most men never would. At 43, she had spent 2 decades as Bumpy's partner, not his decoration. She managed financial operations, maintained supplier relationships, and commanded respect from men who had killed for less than a perceived insult. When she occupied that corner table, she wasn't hiding in her husband's shadow. She was claiming space that belonged to her through her own authority. The regulars knew her, greeted her with genuine respect, understood that disrespecting Mame meant disrespecting Bumpy, which meant choosing elaborate suicide. Whitmore's approach carried all the arrogance of a man who had never been told no by someone he couldn't purchase or intimidate. The champagne glass hit her table like a declaration of ownership, expensive crystal that probably cost more than most people in that room earned in a month. When she rejected him, when she identified herself as married to Bumpy Johnson, he responded with the casual cruelty of someone who viewed other people's boundaries as suggestions rather than requirements. The racial slur that followed wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate assertion of what he believed was the natural hierarchy, a reminder that in his world, her marriage and dignity meant nothing compared to his desire and checkbook. The room's reaction happened in layers. Musicians heard it first, instruments faltering as the word poisoned the air. Nearby tables went silent next, conversations dying as people processed what had been said. The bartender's hands stopped moving. Even casual tourists sensed something fundamental had shifted. Then Whitmore compounded his mistake by reaching across the table, wrapping his fingers around Mame's wrist with the casual ownership of a man selecting fruit at a market, completely unaware that he had just signed his own destruction warrant. At exactly that moment, the front door opened. Every person in the Red Rooster who mattered knew what that sound meant, knew who was arriving, knew that the mathematics of
toast
consequence were about to be demonstrated with brutal
To the
precision.
beginning
Every person
of
except
the
Harrison
end.
Whitmore III, whose hand remained locked around the wrist of the one woman in Harlem you never, ever touched. Bumpy Johnson crossed the Red Rooster floor with the measured pace of a man who had never needed to hurry toward violence, because violence understood it should wait for his arrival. He stopped precisely 3 feet from the table, where Harrison Whitmore III still maintained his grip on Mame's wrist, taking in the complete scene with surgical assessment. His voice
Where is
emerged
it?
barely above
I told you
conversational
what would
volume,
happen if you
carrying
crossed
none
me.
of the rage
You're
that lesser
finished.
men would have displayed, containing instead the flat certainty of a judge delivering a sentence already decided by higher mathematics. He offered Whitmore 30 seconds to stand, walk to the door, and pretend this encounter had never occurred. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion, without negotiation, a simple binary choice between wisdom and destruction. Whitmore responded with gin-fueled laughter, tightening his grip on Mame's arm while announcing that he went where his money took him and took orders from no one he considered beneath his station. That was the moment the timer hit 0. What followed was not a brawl, but an industrial accident
shouldn't have come here
engineered by
tonight,
human
kid.
hands.
You know
The
what
entire
happens to
physical
snitches.
altercation lasted exactly 45 seconds, each movement calculated for maximum message rather than maximum damage. Bumpy's first strike targeted Whitmore's jaw, a precise uppercut that shattered the mandible in 2 places, ensuring that for months to come, speech would become labor and eating would become pain. The second movement broke 3 fingers on the hand that had touched Mame, each bone snapping with distinct finality. The dominant hand that had placed the uninvited drink now rendered permanently damaged in ways that would affect every future signature, every document, every basic function. The systematic nature of the beating followed logic refined over 3 decades of enforcing respect in environments where legal systems provided no protection. Each injury corresponded to a specific insult requiring specific restitution. The racial slur earned 2 broken ribs delivered with knee strikes that left Whitmore gasping on the floor, unable to draw full breath, forced to experience the suffocation of consequences. The invasion of personal space earned a shattered left wrist, crushed against a mahogany table edge with such force that doctors would later debate whether full reconstruction was possible. Then the most terrifying thing happened.
You imbecile!
The room
This
returned to
suit
normal.
cost a fortune.
Bumpy
Get the
straightened his
manager
suit
now.
jacket, checked his tie alignment, and nodded once to the band leader. The trumpet player immediately launched into a brisk jazz standard. Waitresses resumed carrying trays. Card games restarted. The patrons understood the protocol. Justice had been served.
Terms are non-negotiable.
The docket was cleared, and life
I understand
continued.
the terms.
This immediate return
I
to
just don't agree
normalcy
with the risk.
was more chilling than the violence itself because it demonstrated how completely routine such enforcement had become, how thoroughly the community understood that certain violations demanded certain responses. Before Whitmore was removed, Bumpy produced a small card that he pinned inside the man's ruined suit jacket using his own lapel pin. The note contained 7 words written in precise block letters. She said no. Remember that. The message wasn't primarily for Whitmore, who would spend weeks understanding what he had lost. The note was for the doctors who would treat him, the police who would investigate, and most importantly, for the next wealthy man who might consider Harlem a playground where money purchased immunity from consequences. 2 of Bumpy's men materialized from positions throughout the club, lifting Whitmore with practiced efficiency, carrying him through the back exit to a car that would deposit him at Harlem Hospital's emergency entrance with no identification of who delivered him. The hospital staff would find a man with catastrophic injuries and 0 witnesses willing to provide
I told you to
statements.
handle this. Now look
Police
what happened.
detectives would arrive
Don't
at the
make me
Red Rooster to
confine
discover
you.
a club full of people who had seen absolutely nothing. As Whitmore was wheeled into emergency surgery at 11:47 that night, Bumpy Johnson stood in a phone booth 3 blocks away, dialing Malcolm Ice Pick Williams. His voice carried the same flat tone he had used
I
to
told you
offer
this was
Whitmore
confidential.
his initial
If that briefcase
ultimatum.
is compromised,
The
you're
lessons just
finished.
started, he
It's not
said.
compromised, sir.
Get me
I
everything
swear.
on the Whitmore family,
So I told the
business,
copper,
personal,
I don't
financial,
know nothing about no missing
everything.
shipment.
The physical beating was complete,
You kill
but
me.
the
you
real
really do.
education was just beginning. By 12:14 Saturday morning, less than 90 minutes after Harrison Whitmore III hit the Red Rooster floor, Bumpy Johnson's intelligence network was already spinning across 5 boroughs and 3 states. The same machinery that moved numbers, slips, and narcotics through Harlem with surgical precision could just as easily move information. Numbers runners operating near the Garment District received midnight calls with simple instructions. Anything involving the Whitmore name required immediate reporting. At 1:37, a hotel maid on the Upper East Side was awakened by a quiet knock and a request for everything she knew about Harrison's private visits to the city. By 2:15, a dock worker at the Port of New York, who had been on Bumpy's payroll for 6 years, was making chalk marks on freight manifests, noting every Whitmore textile shipment scheduled for the coming weeks. The intelligence that flowed back painted a comprehensive portrait of vulnerabilities hidden beneath respectability. Shipping routes revealed critical dependencies on specific union labor at key ports. Bottlenecks where strategic work stoppages could paralyze entire supply chains. Labor contracts exposed relationships with factories operating on margins thin enough that losing a single major client would trigger cascading failures. Business partnerships uncovered connections to other wealthy families whose reputations couldn't survive association with scandal. More damaging were the personal secrets, a pattern of infidelity documented through hotel registrations and witness statements from staff, gambling debts settled through shell companies, and creative tax arrangements that would fascinate federal investigators. Bumpy reviewed these documents with the detachment of a surgeon examining X-rays before an operation. The beating at the Red Rooster had been necessary theater, immediate justice for immediate disrespect. But what he envisioned now transcended personal revenge. This would be systematic destruction as public policy, designed to establish precedent that would protect his community long after this specific incident faded from memory. Break one man completely, teach 10 others permanently. The Whitmore family would become a cautionary tale, their downfall so thorough and public that future generations of entitled men would calculate consequences before disrespecting black women in establishments under his protection. The Italian connection provided access to resources that street power alone couldn't match. At 9:22 Saturday morning, Bumpy met with a Genovese representative in a closed after-hours spot, leveraging relationships carefully cultivated over 2 decades of mutually beneficial arrangements. By Saturday afternoon, dock workers at 3 separate ports received instructions to slow-walk Whitmore shipments, introducing delays that would void time-sensitive delivery contracts. By Sunday morning, union representatives at textile factories initiated quality control disputes that would halt production for mandatory inspections. By Monday afternoon, trucking companies experienced sudden labor shortages that left Whitmore merchandise sitting in warehouses while competitors' goods moved freely to retail destinations. Meanwhile, the official investigation limped forward with predictable futility. Detectives arrived at the Red Rooster Saturday morning, carrying notebooks and hollow authority, asking routine questions about the previous night's altercation. They received identical answers from every witness. People had been drinking, tempers flared, there was a scuffle, everyone left. Security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the relevant time frame. The bartender had been in the stockroom. Musicians had been taking a break between sets. The detectives departed with a report that said everything and revealed nothing, understanding that Harlem would handle Harlem's problems according to Harlem's justice system. Tuesday morning at 10:30, Harrison Whitmore Jr. arrived from Connecticut in a black Lincoln Continental, followed by a second car carrying 3 lawyers from the family's retained firm. He stormed through Harlem Hospital demanding immediate arrests, threatening to leverage political connections reaching the mayor's office and beyond. In his son's hospital room, staring at the wired jaw and casted hand, the elder Whitmore declared war on what he called these people, vowing to use every resource at his disposal to shut down every black-owned business in Harlem until someone provided information leading to prosecution.
What's your comment on
he
the
had
allegation?
no idea that in making that declaration, he had just escalated a settled street incident into total warfare with a man who specialized in teaching entire systems the permanent cost of disrespect. Week 1 began Monday morning at 8:15 with what appeared to be routine administrative complications. The first Whitmore textile shipment sat untouched on a Brooklyn dock, while longshoremen cited safety concerns requiring immediate inspection. A delay orchestrated through Bumpy's connections to Genovese family labor coordinators who controlled port operations. By Wednesday afternoon, quality control issues emerged simultaneously at 3 separate Whitmore factories. each one triggering mandatory shutdowns under union agreements that had been standard boilerplate for decades, but now revealed themselves as precisely crafted legal weapons. Thursday brought wildcat strikes at the primary distribution center,
fans, sir.
workers demanding renegotiation of terms that had never been questioned in 50 years of operation. Friday at 4:30, Macy's canceled their contract citing failure to meet delivery deadlines, triggering penalty clauses in 6 additional agreements that would cost more than the original orders. Every disruption carried official documentation, union authorization, and legal justification that made sabotage impossible to prove.
Demand justice.
Week 2 escalated from operational chaos to financial strangulation. Tuesday morning at 9:47, federal tax investigators received anonymous packages containing 15 years of Whitmore business documentation, meticulously organized to highlight creative accounting practices that operated in legal gray areas but would fascinate auditors trained to find. Irregularities. The years initiated comprehensive reviews that immediately froze corporate accounts pending investigation. By Thursday, banks that had courted Whitmore business for generations suddenly discovered regulatory concerns that prevented extending additional credit. Suppliers who had operated on 60-day payment terms abruptly demanded cash on delivery. The family that had wielded money as a weapon for 3 generations found their financial ammunition locked away by bureaucratic procedure, creating liquidity crisis that paralyzed operations while competitors sensed weakness and moved to capture abandoned market share. Week 3 delivered surgical strikes against personal foundations Harrison Whitmore III had assumed were immune to consequences. Tuesday afternoon at 2:23, a courier delivered a sealed package to the Connecticut estate addressed to Mrs. Harrison Whitmore III. Inside was not a threat, but a curated portfolio of betrayal, photographs timestamped to match business trips that never happened, receipts for jewelry she never received, witness statements from hotel staff documenting 5 years of systematic infidelity. Beneath the evidence lay complete divorce papers, pre-prepared by a prestigious Manhattan law firm, requiring only her signature to initiate proceedings that would entitle her to half of whatever assets survived federal audit. She signed them Thursday morning after consulting her own attorney, who confirmed the evidence was legally admissible and financially devastating. The precision of Bumpy's campaign revealed strategic thinking that transcended street justice and approached military doctrine. Each attack targeted a distinct pillar supporting Whitmore's constructed identity. Business operations faced coordinated sabotage through union connections that made resistance impossible. Financial infrastructure experienced federal investigation that prevented access to capital. Marriage dissolved under documented evidence that weaponized Harrison's own habits against him. Reputation crumbled as society columnists reported family troubles with barely concealed satisfaction. The psychological torture was exquisite in its simplicity. Harrison knew exactly who orchestrated his destruction,
You give us
but
10%
could
of the
prove
tape
nothing
by
without
Friday,
admitting the racial
or you
assault
don't
that
operate
triggered
in
it.
this town.
Meanwhile, the official police investigation continued its predictable futility. Detectives who returned to the Red Rooster found the same wall of silence, the same malfunctioning security systems, the same witnesses who had seen absolutely nothing. The case file grew thicker with meaningless interviews, while the real justice system operated through channels no badge could access. Other wealthy families observed the Whitmore destruction with calculating self-preservation. Connecticut society began declining dinner invitations. Business partners discovered scheduling conflicts. The social exile happened quietly but completely, as the upper class understood that association with radioactive names carried contagion risk. 6 weeks after the incident, Harrison Whitmore III received a final envelope. Inside was a photograph of the Red Rooster exterior and 10 words in block letters, "Your education is complete. Leave New York, or we'll schedule advanced classes." Within 62 days, the Whitmore textile empire transitioned from generational stability to complete organizational collapse.
We are huge fans,
What began
sir.
as delayed shipments and union disputes
appreciate that. Who should I make this
metastasized
out
into
to?
systematic failure that business
Don't
schools
you
would
ever
later study
interrupt
as a
me when I'm
model of
talking.
coordinated
You hear me?
destruction.
This is my
Though none would
territory,
ever
and
identify
you
the
will
true
respect
architect.
that.
Major retailers canceled contracts, citing reliability concerns that triggered penalty clauses, draining remaining liquidity faster than any emergency measures could compensate. Banks that had courted Whitmore business for 50 years quietly revoked credit lines, citing market volatility, but responding to whispers that association carried reputational risk no institution could absorb. Key executives, reading the signs with professional survival instincts, accepted offers from competitors who had orchestrated their recruitment through intermediaries connected to Bumpy's network. Within 8 weeks,
Stop right there.
the machinery
Whatever
that
you
had
think you
generated
know,
wealth
you're wrong.
since the industrial
You
boom
have to
ground
listen to
to
me.
a
It's
permanent
not
halt.
safe.
Harrison Whitmore III's personal reconstruction proved impossible despite surgical intervention that consumed his dwindling resources. The shattered jaw healed incorrectly, leaving him with a permanent speech impediment that transformed every conversation into a reminder of consequences. His dominant hand never regained full function, the crushed bones and severed tendons fusing into a twisted claw that made signing documents an ordeal and simple tasks a daily humiliation. Chronic pain became his constant companion, the kind that prescription medication could dull but never eliminate, creating a dependency that added pharmaceutical bills to his mounting debts. Each throb in
I'm
bone
only
and
going to say
tendon
this once.
carried the same
You stay out
message
of my
branded into
territory,
his nervous system.
or you won't live
Cause,
to see tomorrow.
effect, consequence. The arrogance that had defined him dissolved into twitchy paranoia, a constant awareness that shadows might contain retribution
Easy
he
now.
hadn't yet paid.
We knew this wouldn't be simple.
Connecticut society
We just need a moment to
executed its
think.
exile
It's
with
getting
the
too hot in
refined
here.
cruelty
We have
that
to move
only
fast.
old money deploys. The mechanism was invisible but absolute. Invitations that had been automatic for 3 generations simply ceased. Country club memberships came up for renewal and were quietly declined, citing obscure procedural concerns. Business associations discovered regulatory reasons why continued participation was impossible. The same families who had protected the Whitmores with judges and senators now protected themselves by severing association, understanding that proximity to radioactive
very
names
carefully.
carried
This is the
contagion,
only warning
risked
you will
no
receive.
rational dynasty
Do
would
exactly
accept.
as
Through
I
whispers
say.
at charity galas and conversations in private clubs, the broader
Certainly,
message
sir.
permeated
Would you like
New
the
York's
dressing on the
elite
side?
circles with
And
the
for your wine
velocity of
selection
scandal
tonight.
wrapped in moral instruction. The details varied in retelling, but the core understanding remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had systematically destroyed a textile dynasty because Harrison Whitmore III disrespected his wife. The implications were clear to anyone capable of pattern recognition. Harlem operated under rules that money couldn't override, and violating those rules carried penalties that could erase family names from social registers permanently. The final humiliation arrived when the Whitmore estate went to auction. The property that had anchored 3 generations sold to satisfy creditor judgments. The winning bidder
I can't believe
was
you
a
just
shell
said that.
corporation whose ownership
I know, but
structure
look at your
traced through
face.
multiple legal entities before disappearing into opacity that even investigative journalists couldn't penetrate. Only a few people understood that the purchase had been financed through organizations connected to Bumpy's network, meaning the house that textile money built now belonged to the man whose wife they had insulted. Harrison Whitmore III vanished from New York entirely, last confirmed working a minor administrative position in a Baltimore shipping office, processing invoices with his damaged hand. 1 year later, a young businessman from Boston entered the Red Rooster and approached a woman sitting alone. Before he could complete his rehearsed opening line, she pointed to a framed photograph mounted behind the bar. Harrison Whitmore III in his hospital bed, jaw wired shut, eyes reflecting defeat. The businessman apologized immediately and left. The legend had become infrastructure, doing the work of enforcement through reputation alone. The systematic destruction of the Whitmore dynasty accomplished something that transcended criminal enterprise and approached legitimate governance. For 2 decades, Ellsworth Johnson had operated as Harlem's shadow infrastructure, providing services the official system refused to deliver. Dispute resolution when police ignored complaints, financial protection when banks denied loans, justice when courts looked away from crimes against black residents. But the calculated dismantling of a Connecticut textile fortune elevated his authority to an entirely different category. He had demonstrated capacity to enforce respect across racial and economic boundaries that supposedly defined American social order, transforming from neighborhood numbers king into the unofficial mayor of a territory that existed on city maps, but operated under separate jurisdiction entirely. At 11:43 on Saturday night, September 17, 1955, the story began its migration through New York's interconnected social networks, with the velocity of information that carried both entertainment value and survival instruction. The narrative metastasized through distinct ecosystems, adapting to each audience while maintaining its core warning. In downtown jazz clubs frequented by liberal professionals who dabbled in what they called Negro culture, bartenders whispered cautionary tales to patrons who got too drunk and too bold about venturing uptown. The details emerged in fragments: a Connecticut heir, a hospital stay, contracts mysteriously canceled, estates sold to cover debts. In Connecticut boardrooms, the Whitmore collapse became required parable during executive meetings, a reminder that certain territories operated under rules corporate lawyers couldn't navigate and family connections couldn't override. What made this incident historically seismic was its revelation of 1955 power structures operating beneath official narratives of racial hierarchy. This was the year Emmett Till's murderers walked free after a trial that mocked justice, when black men who defended their families typically faced immediate legal persecution, when the system existed primarily to enforce white supremacy rather than protect human dignity. Yet Bumpy had orchestrated comprehensive revenge against a wealthy white dynasty and faced zero legal consequences. Police investigations stalled in walls of silence. Federal authorities focused on Whitmore's tax irregularities rather than investigating who orchestrated them. No prosecutor filed charges. This immunity demonstrated influence that transcended street power and approached institutional protection. Relationships with Italian crime families and corrupt officials that created zones where different mathematics applied. The lasting behavioral modifications manifested in measurable ways throughout the city's entertainment districts. Wealthy thrill seekers, who had treated Harlem as exotic safari destination, began calculating risk like investors studying volatile markets. The casual racism that had been standard practice in mixed establishments declined noticeably as white patrons weighed whether momentary satisfaction justified permanent consequences. Club owners reported fewer incidents requiring intervention. The colonial entitlement that had defined downtown money venturing uptown simply evaporated, replaced by practiced courtesy rooted in survival instinct rather than genuine respect. 6 months after the incident, at 10:15 on a Friday evening in March 1956, the Red Rooster operated with transformed dynamics that regular patrons recognized immediately. Bumpy and Mame occupied the same corner table where everything had begun. The same jazz quartet played sophisticated standards that bled into the night air, but the atmosphere carried different frequency entirely. Every person entering understood the invisible architecture governing that space, the unwritten protocols determining who could sit where and how interactions would proceed. Behind the bar, visible only to staff during shift changes, a typed card had been mounted in the manager's sightline: "Respect is not negotiable." Management reserves the right to enforce this policy. The evening concluded with quiet ceremony that carried historical weight. Bumpy raised his glass in a silent toast to Mame, acknowledging partnership that had survived another systematic challenge and emerged stronger. Across the room, a wealthy white couple from the financial district entered, immediately recognized the significance of the corner table through reputation and survival instinct, and chose seats on the opposite side without direction. The lesson had been taught. The legend was established. In Harlem, respect was no longer requested, it was mandatory.